So again, welcome everyone this evening, this beautiful, sunny, windy day in Ottawa. It was almost too warm to wear a coat today. It was so warm. So as I mentioned before the meditation, we're going to be exploring what's called the five aggregates or five khandas that the Buddha spoke about in a few different contexts. I'm going to start with a quote from Dorothy Thompson which is from 1939. One cannot exist today as a person. One cannot exist in full consciousness without having a showdown with oneself, without having to define what it is that one lives by, without being clear in one's mind what matters and what does not matter. A showdown with oneself. In many ways, that's what the Buddha was, one of his primary teachings is this idea of almost like a showdown with oneself, is seeing beyond our conceptions of what we think of as ourself, that we spend so much time protecting and trying to control what happens to it, and seeing beyond that to seeing what's on Dorothy Thompson's perspective, what matters. And so seeing our true nature, so our true essence. So the five aggregates or khandas, what the Buddha does here is gives us five things where we look to as our sense of self. This is what we cling to as a self. And he gave us five, and often said everything you see as a sense of self arises within one of these five aggregates, and he calls them aggregates because they're collections or of factors. So it's like a collection or a heap. The other translation is heap of these kinds of factors. So this is one of the key characteristics of the Buddha Dharma, is the notion of not self. That there isn't a permanent, unchanging essence that we call a self. And this notion of self is consistent with the Buddha's middle way, right? So it's kind of the middle way between complete non-existence, because there is something that exists, and permanent existence. So it's this kind of middle way that again he was taking. And the dependent origination teachings that we spoke about, that goes back maybe a year ago, also describes this, that the self is dependently arising. It's coming out of causes and conditions that are constantly changing. People remember those teachings. It very much links into this teaching as well. So today we're going to explore that. I'm going to just kind of give you the background of these five aggregates, mention what the five are, and then we'll go into the five of them in more detail in future weeks. You can look at them as kind of the building blocks that go into our self. When we look for the sense of self, we say, well, how would you describe, your sense of self, of this I? These are the kind of factors that we would tend to go towards, these five aggregates of clinging. So the the Buddha raises the five aggregates in the first noble truth. If you remember, again, less than a year ago, like more like 6 months ago, we went through the four noble truths, and the first noble truth contains a mention of the five aggregates, the five khandas. And I'll give you the quote where it comes out regarding the first noble truth. Now this, monks, and monks refers to all practitioners, is the noble truth of dukkha. So that's the first noble truth, the noble truth of dukkha. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, distress, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha. Separation from the loved is dukkha. Not getting what is one wants is dukkha. In short, the five aggregates of clinging are dukkha. So he talks about all those things, and then he says, in short, the five aggregates, clinging to those five aggregates as a sense of self is dukkha. So in other words, underlying all the suffering that he just stated, in fact, any suffering that arises is based on us clinging into a sense of self, which is in fact clinging to the five aggregates, clinging to these factors as a sense of self. And all these factors are also stamped with the three marks of existence of impermanence, unsatisfactoriness, and selflessness. You could say that these five heaps or aggregates or collections of factors explain the totality of what we think is reality, and what we think of as a self experiencing the world. So we can turn our attention towards these, and in the guided meditation, I was kind of presenting it as a contemplation, a meditative contemplation. Can you find your true essence in the body? Right? Can you find your true essence? And we actually went through the five aggregates in that meditation. So understanding the five aggregates really brings insight into our true nature, right? So it brings insight into reality. And so when we're talking about seeing, non-dual reality, at the basis of this, the kind of first step is seeing the truth of not self. It's really the key teaching of the Buddha, you could say, when you look at the first noble truth, and he's basically saying, the five aggregates of clinging are behind dukkha, behind the suffering that arises. So we investigate these as kind of you could say, the first steps in seeing our true nature. So the Buddha never said, there's not a self, believe me. He said, go out and see if you can find a self in these five areas. Right? And tried to capture the totality of our experience in these five aggregates. So in order to investigate these five aggregates, the first thing we have to do is we have to be mindful or conscious of them. So of course, mindfulness is the basis of this practice as well, where we have to be conscious as we go out through our day so that we can see the arising of the five aggregates, which is so crucial to all these practices, right? This is what you learn by looking at your direct experience, by being conscious for it, right? I mean, that's the only way this practice has fruit. I just did a talk on Boomerang on mindfulness being the opposite of autopilot, and how autopilot, what autopilot is, when we're kind of not our mind's on something other than what we're doing in the moment, right? The mind's thinking about one thing, something other than what we're present with. And of course, the study that I often quote is the Collingsworth and Gilbert study, where he found that 47% of the time we're not actually present with what we're doing in each moment. So the invitation with this practice is to be present for more and more of our moments, be conscious of them. And then by being conscious in more and more of our moments, we can actually investigate the nature of what's experiencing these moments, right? So we're experiencing the nature of this thing we call a self in each of these moments. Of course, if we're on autopilot, there's nothing to investigate because life's just kind of rolling on. We're kind of unconscious. We can be triggered. Our emotional state can change. We're just not, we just kind of get tossed around by whatever happens to arise spontaneously without our consent. It's just, we're really kind of at the mercy of this almost steamroller. So the first is being mindful, then we can investigate, see our true nature. And by understanding these five aggregates, we can start to see the true nature of our existence. We can see non-dual reality. We kind of see beyond duality into non-duality. So that's why I wanted to kind of back up and go into these five aggregates. And we like all the teachings, we understand the five aggregates and kind of those three ways. We understand them intellectually, which this talk can help you do, and we can we get kind of a direct insight by looking at how they play out in our direct experience. So we are constantly seeing in our direct experience and investigating. And then the third is, we integrate that seeing into our life. So we investigate these aggregates, investigate them. Right? Be conscious of your moments, and then investigate these five aggregates. We can start to see that these things, these five elements, come from nowhere and go to nowhere. They just arise and disappear. They're impermanent. They're just arising, disappearing. We can see that constant flow of each of these five aggregates. And we can start to see that our whole experience of the world is nothing other than these five things occurring, these five collections of factors. They're coming into existence and disappearing based on causes and conditions. And that's our experience of the world, is these five collections of factors. And we can also start, the third thing we can start to see is that none of them can be seen as our essence, as a me or an I or a mine, an unchanging essence. They're constantly just changing. They're rising, fading, shifting. I'll go through each of them in over the next several weeks, one by one. And finally we see that when we cling to these aggregates as a sense of self, as the Buddha called them, the five aggregates of clinging, that we suffer. And that when we don't cling to them as a sense of self, that we don't suffer. That's suffer, the cessation of suffering. So those are four really deep kind of understandings that we can see. We can see that these aggregates come from nowhere and go nowhere. They just arise and disappear. We can start to see that our whole experience of the world is nothing more than these five aggregates coming and going. We can see that none of these can be seen as our essence, as an unchanging self, I or me or mine. And we can see that when we cling to them, we suffer. And when we don't cling to them, we don't suffer. And since they're all formations rising based on causes and conditions, they're conditioned formations. And as the Buddha said, all formations are impermanent. All formations are unsatisfactory. And all phenomena and everything whatsoever are not self. So we suffer because we cling to these as a sense of self. So our task is to investigate them in those four ways that I just mentioned. When the Buddha, if you look through the sutras, when the Buddha was ever asked if there was a self, he never said, no, there's not a self. He never made declarations like that. He always would say, he'd pose questions like, well, do you see a sense of self in the body? A permanent sense of self? And then he would kind of go through those kinds of, asking people to investigate where they can see this sense of self. He often said to define yourself in any way is to limit yourself. Right? To define yourself in any of these ways is to limit yourself, because your true nature is limitless. That's a beautiful way to kind of look at it. Any way that we define ourselves is limiting. So I'm going to go through what the five aggregates are rather quickly, and I won't go into them in too much detail tonight. They're translated, mostly in the way that I'll give you the translation. As the first one is form or rupa, which essentially refers to the body. So in the meditation, I invited you to explore, to contemplate in that sense, to contemplate if you can find your true essence in your body, the sense of an unchanging self in the body, rupa. The other is thoughts and emotions. So thoughts that are arising. Can you find your sense of self in thoughts? And can you find a sense of self in the feeling tone in vedana, that pleasant, unpleasant, neutral? Can you find a sense of self in sanna or perceptions? Perceptions arising. And the last is vinnana. Can you find a sense of self in your sense experience and sense consciousness? So that, you kind of think of the material form as form, the kind of the hardware that you can poke at and kind of see. It's stuff that, you look in the mirror and there's this body, and we can identify with this body as a sense of self. And we can see how that causes suffering. We can see, is it really our essence? Right? We can look at vedana. The rest is kind of the software, the stuff that's happening, the internal experiences, this liking, disliking, or not caring about a sense contact. So there's this kind of first subjective taste of an experience that arises: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, liking, disliking, don't care. Is that who we truly are? You can look at the perceptions. So this is the capacity of the mind to kind of identify marks of an object and relate it to memory, and then a perception of that object arrives on that basis. It arises when we have sense contact, sense consciousness, sense object, and sense organ. We have contact, disliking, liking, don't caring arises, and that perception arises. Is that a sense of self? It kind of identifies names, classifies, categorizes. It enables the mind to kind of recognize forms and odors and tastes and mental objects as they occur. So when a sound occurs, you have vibrations on your ears, but perception recognizes the sound and names it as like a bird or an airplane. So that's perception at work. So is that a sense of self? You can investigate that. The mental formations, thoughts, emotions, it's kind of an umbrella term for the kind of the volitional, emotional aspects of our experience, mental factors. And then there's sense experience, or sense consciousness is the tie-in. It's what, we've talked about. You can have a sense organ, the ear, say. You can have a sense object, which would be sound. You need then the sense consciousness for it to be part of your experience. If you're missing one of those three, it doesn't register as part of your experience. You need the ear, the sound, and the sense consciousness for it to register. as an experience. And I'm using the word consciousness as kind of a small c consciousness, as opposed to, sometimes I use it in a broader sense to refer to um, our true nature of awareness or consciousness. So this is just kind of our sense experience that we're talking about here. So you have the six, the five senses. So it's the small c consciousness, not the true self or ultimate c consciousness. So these aggregates, they contain our entire experience. So the Buddha would say nothing lies outside are these aggregates in terms of our experience. And, each one has many aspects to it. For example, the body has all these parts, and the Buddha talked about the 32 parts of material form that we call the body, and there's the three aspects of vedana or feeling tone of pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and so on. So each one has different aspects to it. So it's only by directly experiencing these aggregates as not a self, an I, or a me, or a mine, that we can experience true freedom, see our true nature, and see and realize non-dual reality. But what the Buddha taught was that we tend towards clinging to these aggregates as a sense of self. And this prevents us from seeing things as they really are, because our life gets tied up in struggling with the present moment and protecting and controlling this self that we've imagined to be these aggregates. Right? And as Dorothy Thompson said at the beginning, sometimes we have a showdown with that sense of self. That the Buddha is, in a sense, inviting us to a showdown. Yeah. And it doesn't necessarily, this sense doesn't, we can start to see it and see through it, but it doesn't always, the mind doesn't let go of it easily, I could say. There's very much a clinging that's there, a belief, deeply held beliefs that have formed over many years, and fears, really. Here's a quote from the Buddha, where the Buddha talks about this sense of self and the five aggregates. Suppose a man who is not blind were to behold the many bubbles on the Ganges River as they were flowing along, and he should watch them and carefully examine them. After carefully examining them, they will appear to him empty, unreal, and unsubstantial. In exactly the same way does the meditator behold all material form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and sense consciousness, whether past, present, or future, one's own or external, gross or subtle, lofty or low, far or near. And he watches them and examines them carefully. And after carefully examining them, they appear to him empty, unreal, and unsubstantial. And then he gives these five things. He says, metaphors are I love them. The body is like a lump of foam. The feelings like a water bubble. Perception like a void. Formations like a plantain tree, which is a banana type of banana, I guess you could say, with no inner core. and consciousness like jugglery or trickery. So he's really kind of pointing to the insubstantial nature with those metaphors, the insubstantial, impermanent. To me, that those metaphors really help me in terms of seeing and investigating. The body is like a lump of foam. Feelings are like a water bubble, just pop. Perceptions like a void mirage. Formations like a plantain tree. I love that one. And sense consciousness like jugglery or trickery, like magician, the hands in the work of a musician. So those, if you find those helpful as I did, then you kind of can contemplate them in that regard. But he's clear, they will see them as empty, unreal, and unsubstantial. Those 5 elements, 5 aggregates. So these are at the very heart of the Buddhist teachings, these 5 aggregates. There's no self that's behind, a part of, or in control of the aggregates. They're just arising, fading, they're insubstantial, impermanent. So we have to see them as they truly are. And that's the invitation, that's the practice. So we will, over the next several weeks, explore what it means by how we can investigate each of these aggregates, each of the 5 aggregates.